Good afternoon, good morning, and welcome to the latest in the series of GSA Snapshot Webinars. In the next 30 minutes, we're going to be focusing on the latest global data for 5G spectrum networks and devices. Simon Sherrington, the head of research at GSA, will run through the presentation with the latest data in it. The PowerPoint will be available to you after the event on the GSA website, as will a complete recording of today's session. If you have any questions, there will be time at the end to put those to Simon. So I'd encourage you to, as we go along, to pose any questions you have in the questions box. We'll then be able to collate those at the end and put them to Simon for sort of the last 10 minutes or so of the event. But with that, I'll turn you straight over to Simon now to dig into the data. Simon.
Thank you. Hi everyone, welcome to this webinar. Thank you for joining us. As introduced, I'm Simon Sherrington and I head up the GSA's research efforts. With the world of 5G developing very rapidly, we thought it was important to bring you an update on all things 5G as we come to the end of the first half of 2021, 6 months that seem to have disappeared very, very quickly. I'm going to be presenting a variety of data sets that draw on information and statistics taken from a wide range of GSA's reports and databases. In particular, its Gambod devices database, its spectrum pricing database, its databases on networks, technologies and spectrum, its new private mobile networks database, and its regular 5G update reports. So 2020 saw 5G move to center stage in terms of network operator activities, but 2021 has seen continued growth for 5G infrastructure deployment and service launches, and the charts and statistics here really tell the story. By the end of May, 443 operators in 133 countries or territories were investing in 5G. And of those, 188 operators had announced they'd deployed 3GPP compliant technology in their live networks. Of those, a total of 169 operators in 70 countries or territories had launched one or more 3GPP compliant 5G services. And we track broadly two types there. There are fully mobile services and there are fixed wireless access services. And you can see on the slide we give a bit of a breakdown. We've identified 159 operators in 66 countries or territories that have launched 3GPP compliant 5G mobile services, and 62 operators in 35 countries or territories that have launched 5G fixed wireless or home broadband services. In addition to that, we've identified 5 what we call soft launches, where launches have been announced, but there are no real services for customers to get access to. If we compare that with where we were at the start of the year, only 135 operators had launched a 5G service at that point, so we're up 25% in terms of number of operators providing services in just 5 months. Also, by way of comparison, although there's no exact overlap between the LTE and 5G data sets, as obviously there are some companies that operate LTE networks that don't have 5G, and some that have 5G that don't operate LTE, it means roughly the equivalent of around 20% of all LTE operators have launched 5G, and the equivalent of more than half of all operators with LTE networks are investing in 5G services. And as the map shows, 5G services are now launched in all regions, and there's a bit of a breakdown there, sort of large regional scale. GSA has identified 108 launch networks in Europe, Middle East and Africa, 39 in the Asia Pacific, and 22 networks in the Americas. And of course, counts not everything. Whilst the Americas may have launched fewer networks, some of those, and particularly those in the US, were amongst the earliest and amongst the largest of the 5G networks, and many networks in other regions are much smaller. We can also expect the number of deployments in the USA to grow quite rapidly as all those companies that have won millimeter wave spectrum start to use it, and many of those that won CBRS priority access licenses or C-band licenses start to use those for 5G networks. You can see from the purple, blue and pink map that nearly all the regions worldwide now have operators investing in 5G. So I say regions in all countries and territories. There are a few gaps in Africa. The blue map to the bottom left shows operators have launched 5G fixed wireless access networks too. Why have I picked that out? Well, fixed wireless access based on either LTE or 5G is an interesting application with quite a bit of momentum. GSA's fixed wireless access report, the latest edition of which will be out in the next day or two, shows there's a strong supplier ecosystem and that over half of the world's LTE operators have launched fixed wireless access services, and 5G fixed wireless access is now coming on strongly, being positioned as a complement to or replacement for fixed line broadband technologies in the home or the business. What message an operator uses is largely depends on its competitive positioning and what networks it already has. And as I mentioned on the previous slide, over 60 operators now offer a fixed 5G fixed wireless access service, which has grown quite significantly in the last few months. Another big trend I want to mention is the investment in private 5G networks. GSA's recently launched private mobile database shows there are now hundreds of private mobile networks being deployed around the world. Our available data suggests that well over 500 companies have been or are investing in private mobile networks based on LTE or 5G. And when we talk about investments there, we mean trials, pilot deployments, commercial network launches, or investment in the licenses that would enable the deployment of the networks. This is likely to be a substantial underestimate, as a lot of information in this market is deemed to be commercially sensitive. Amongst those we've been able to classify by network technology, over 40% of those involve the deployment of 5G infrastructure. And given where we were only a couple of years ago in terms of global rollout of 5G for public networks, that demonstrates the attractions of 5G to private enterprise and government organizations for transforming supply chains, manufacturing environments, are really evident to the users. And as the chart on the right shows, although there are many pilot projects, essentially those where the networks are being used for experimentation or to prove the potential, there are many that are already being deployed on a production basis, so being used actively within the existing corporate networks or within new networks to drive service and other types of manufacturing innovation. So one of the big things about 5G early on was it was supposed to offer much faster speeds. There are a lot of other aspects to 5G focused around connection density and around latency. There's not much data released about those at the moment, although more is likely to come on stream as operators start to deploy ultra-reliable, low-latency communications capable infrastructure. What 5G means to most people at home is speed. How fast is it? So what are operators saying about the speeds of their 5G networks? What these slides are showing are the maximum potential downlink throughput speeds stated by operators in their marketing materials. So the best speeds they have stated that their customers can expect. That's not the same as the average or the typical speed, as that information is much less often published, nor is it the same as the real-world measurements taken by third-party organizations doing drive-bys of mobile towers. Many operators don't promise anything at all. They just promote 5G speed. And of course, the speed they can offer depends a lot on the spectrum that they have access to. And where operators are using existing spectrum that has to be shared with LTE, and the amount of bandwidth they have is smaller, speeds are necessarily lower. Where operators have been granted new spectrum, for instance in the C-band or for millimeter wave, the speeds that they promise tend to be a bit higher. These charts show that marketed or promised 5G service speeds vary widely from sort of tens of megabits per second up to more than gigabit per second. And if we think in terms of gigabits per second, of course, LTE networks, some of them have been able to promise gigabit per second speeds for some time through the deployment of carrier aggregation over a number of different spectrum bands. But actually, the number of networks that can do that is still relatively few. If we look at mobile services and the 5G mobile services that we've been able to identify with maximum marketed speeds, if we take the average of those across the 54 operators, the marketed speed is just over a gigabit per second at 1,145 megabits per second. The speed for 5G fixed wireless access services is a bit slower. We have data on fewer operators for that, but the average there is 648 megabits per second. And that's slightly up on the 604 megabits per second that we identified 6 months ago when we did our previous run of the fixed wireless access report. So you can see that these are quite significant speeds. And whilst customers won't get those all the time, they are at attractive rates to be promoting to try and sign up customers. So I've touched on the importance of spectrum for delivering 5G services. That fact is not lost on governments who've been rapidly making more spectrum available in many countries or territories. But another driver for governments is the benefit to the national purse. Spectrum is worth an awful lot of money, and GSA tracks auctions and the amount of money that is spent acquiring spectrum licenses. And we've done some analysis of what's been happening. And phenomenally, nearly $96 billion has already been spent in 2021 on spectrum auctions and assignments, and we're rapidly approaching the 100 billion mark. Keep an eye out for our next auction data update to see if we cross that line. But that's a huge increase on the 2020 value of 27.5 billion for the entire year, which of course was impacted by COVID. An enormous amount of that money was spent in the USA in their recent auctions, and the Indian auctions earlier this year also generated billions of dollars. But you can see from the charts that the money spent by operators varies widely from country to country. You know, for C-band spectrum, the recent average price of spectrum bought in auctions comes out at $0.123 per megahertz per pop. For microwave, it's roughly 3% of that at $0.0037 per megahertz per pop. Now, of course, the amount operators are willing to spend on spectrum depends on the amount they hold, the length of the license, the extent of any coverage or performance requirements that are attached to the license, the economic value, the money potentially attached to usage of that spectrum, and crucially, the amount of infrastructure that needs to be deployed. And millimeter wave spectrum doesn't travel as far, we know, as low band spectrum or mid band spectrum, so you need an awful lot more infrastructure, and that's reflected in the prices that we see. So governments have been selling the spectrum, operators have been using it. So this slide shows how operators around the world are actually using their spectrum, or more specifically, which of their spectrum assignments they're using for their 5G networks. Now, that's not a straight mapping to auctions. In a number of countries where auctions have yet to take place, we've seen operators launching services using existing spectrum, sharing it between the LTE and 5G networks. But you can clearly see that C-band spectrum between 3,300 and 4,200 megahertz, bands N77 and N78, is way out in front in terms of usage and deployment. We've identified 178 operators holding licenses that are deploying or have deployed in those bands. Millimeter wave is increasingly important. We've identified 112 operators holding licenses. 27 of those are deploying or have started to deploy infrastructure using millimeter wave spectrum. And another range that's increasingly important is 700 megahertz. Now, 700 megahertz has been widely assigned for LTE and is widely used for LTE, but it's also of increasing importance in the context of 5G as a coverage band. And we're expecting over 30 auctions or assignments to happen between now and the end of 2022. So there's a lot of auction activity expected in that spectrum band. More C-band is on the way. Now, these are quite hard to read. There's a lot of data there, and the text is very small. But broadly speaking, these charts are charts that we publish and update on a regular basis, covering C-band, 26, 28 gigahertz, 2,300 megahertz, 4.4 gigahertz, and we're just adding a new set on 700 megahertz, just showing the state of spectrum licensing around the world. Since the end of 2015, we've identified 47 countries or territories that have auctioned or assigned C-band spectrum with the intention of opening up the frequency range for mobile broadband and 5G. And if you look at these charts, you can get the broad picture by just getting the sense that the red colours, the red bars, show those countries or territories that have made the spectrum available for 5G, including on a technology neutral basis. And all the other rows that you can see have got some sort of activity, have been thinking about it, and those with blue bars have planned auctions or assignments, or auctions or assignments are underway. And here's a quick view of our equivalent millimeter wave 24.25 to 29.5 gigahertz charts. Once again, the red bars show the countries that have assigned the spectrum. Blue means it's planning to assign or assignments are underway. Yellow and green colours mean they're thinking about or consulting on plans for spectrum release. 132 operators in 22 countries or territories already hold public licenses, many of those regional, enabling operation of 5G networks using millimeter wave spectrum. And 28 operators are known to be deploying 5G networks using one or other millimeter wave spectrum band, and that includes some of the spectrum bands at higher ranges. Looking at all the millimeter wave ranges, 20 countries or territories have announced formal, by which I mean they're broadly dated timelines, plans for assigning frequencies above 24 gigahertz between now and the end of 2022. So you can see there's still quite a lot of activity planned in that regard. So I've talked a lot about networks and spectrum. The other piece of the puzzle, of course, are the devices. You need to have a good base, a good mix and range of devices in order that users will want to adopt the 5G services once they're made available. And the vendor community has been working over time. There's been rapid growth in the numbers and types of 5G devices that have been announced and that are launched. GSA tracks 5G devices in its Gambod database, which is available to members, including data on the spectrum bands those devices support for non-standalone and standalone 5G. The chart here shows the superb growth in the number of 5G device models that are announced and available. You can see the delta between the announced and the commercially available devices has stayed pretty constant since the start of 2020, with the commercially available numbers following about 6 to 7 months behind the announced numbers. Two big milestones reached in the first half of 2021. We've now got over 800 announced 5G devices and over 500 commercially available devices. And that's up from 176 at the start of the year. So that's quite a rapid expansion in the number of commercially available 5G devices. In the last 3 months alone, the number of announced 5G devices has grown by more than 30%. .5G devices come in a variety of shapes and sizes. GSA, in its tracking activities, has identified 22 announced form factors from 133 different vendors. Phones and indoor and outdoor fixed wireless access CPE continue to be the most prevalent of the 5G devices, and the number of announced devices in each of those categories has grown strongly throughout 2020 and into 2021. And in particular, the number of announced phones has risen really rapidly, increasing by nearly 50% since the end of 2020. And phones represented a little more than 50% of all announced models by the end of May 2021, with a fixed wireless access CPE coming in at about 17.5%. Other device types that have appeared include modules, industrial routers, hotspots. We might expect to see more laptops and tablets appearing going forward as well. What is evident is that the members of the device ecosystem, both chip makers and device makers, have really stepped up to the mark to deliver a strong pool of devices for operators to sell and to provide to their customers. The majority of devices support the C-band spectrum ranges we've seen being widely deployed worldwide. There are 395 devices announced that support the mid-C-band spectrum bands, N77 and N78. And what I should say is that these numbers are an understatement of the market, because there are a number of announced devices not yet commercially available where the amount of information about band support is relatively limited. There's also growing momentum in an additional mid-band range of 4.4 to 5 gigahertz band N79, 326 announced devices there. There's also a growing base of devices supporting the high millimeter wave spectrum. We've identified 77 commercially available devices and 122 announced devices covering each of the key millimeter wave bands. The first networks, of course, to be launched were non-standalone networks operating alongside and using the core LTE infrastructure. The next step for 5G is the introduction of 5G standalone networks, and those are continuing to emerge. The charts here show the number of operators investing in 5G standalone for public networks, and where we've identified operators investing in 5G standalone for public 5G networks. GSA has identified 79 operators in 42 countries worldwide that have been investing in 5G standalone. That compares with around 440 operators investing in non-standalone technologies. And geographically, all regions have now seen some investment. We've also identified at least 12 operators that have launched 5G standalone networks, sometimes on a small basis, sometimes on a large scale. The operators in China amongst those leading the way here. China Mobile, China Telecom and China Unicom have all launched networks. T-Mobile in the US launched 5G standalone nationwide at 600 megahertz. We've also seen launches in South Africa, in Colombia. We've seen launches in Hong Kong, in Austria in a limited way, and Telefonica and Vodafone in Germany, Kuwait, and Singtel in Singapore, with other operators in Singapore due to launch soon. And there are others on the cusp. So STC has activated its 5G standalone network, so we're waiting for confirmation that that's actually available to customers. That's in Saudi Arabia. ITC, another Saudi Arabian player, has announced a soft launch, and in Australia, Telstra has indicated that it's ready to go, having deployed its 5G standalone core. In addition, there have been a variety of contracts announced for the deployment of 5G core network infrastructure over the next couple of years. And the device ecosystem is emerging to support 5G standalone too. So the charts here show the data that we have in Gambod about the number of devices that have been announced supporting 5G standalone, those that we believe are already available, and the mix of different types of devices, largely reflective of the total 5G device ecosystem, with phones dominating, fixed wireless access, CPE being important, but modules also an important category there for devices with 5G standalone support. We're already aware of 456 announced devices that are claimed to support 5G standalone, and of those, over 303 are understood to already be commercially available. And if we look at the 5G devices that are commercially available, all of them, just over 59% of those states have 5G standalone support. Now, it comes with a slight caveat, in as much as very often those devices will need some sort of software upgrade before customers can take advantages of the services. And we've seen operators in some markets issuing those software upgrades as they've launched their new 5G standalone infrastructures. Excuse me. So there's been a lot of activity, a lot of new networks, new network types, auctions, devices. What else can we expect over the course of the next year? Well, a lot more auctions and assignments. There are over 70 auctions and assignments that are either underway or expected by the end of 2022. 33 of those involving spectrum at 700 megahertz. Slightly more, 36 involving C-band spectrum, 20 involving millimetre wave spectrum. At current growth rates, we might expect over 750 commercial 5G devices perhaps by the end of the year, and at current trajectory, perhaps over 230 launched 5G networks by the end of the year. And of course, there's also GSA's new spectrum database, which I'm going to mention here. That's been launched in recent months. It's ready for you to use if you are a customer. It provides detailed mobile spectrum assignment data for the majority of the world. New countries are being added regularly. Assignments are being updated regularly, and you can search by country and spectrum range. It's available to all members and associates. And I would encourage you to check that out. The slide here gives you a couple of screenshots of what's going on there. That brings me to the end of the presentation. The snapshot on global 5G, and it's time perhaps to answer a few questions. Richard, I don't know if we've had many come in.
Yeah, great. Thanks very much, Simon. Yes, we had a fair few questions in, so I encourage you to please do ask any more if you have any. Couple of points just for clarifying first, Simon. When you talk about investing in 5G, what's considered when customers are tagged as investing in 5G? If operators have invested in solutions since, for example, 2016 that support 5G, should that also be counted?
We count operators investing in 5G if they are engaging in tests or trials of the technology or pilot projects, if they are acquiring licenses that would enable them to deploy 5G networks, typically spectrum licenses, and also if we know they are actively deploying the infrastructure, have deployed the infrastructure, or are operating a network. And we would still count an operator if they'd been doing testing and trialing, or started testing and trialing some time ago but hadn't yet launched.
Super, thanks. And again, another clarifying question on, I think it's slide 5 on the download speeds, the x-axis, I don't think was visible. I'll go back to slide 5 so you can see it. Just what was on the x-axis on this graph.
See, it's the x-axis on those charts is not actually, there's no label on it. Each one of those columns represents an operator's data. So there are 54 operators with data in the top one and 35 operators in the bottom. So each of those is an individual operator, but we've not named them on those charts just because it would be unreadable.
Great stuff, thanks. And couple of questions on fixed wireless access. What percentage of the fixed wireless access services are in millimetre wave frequencies?
Oh, very good question, which, to be honest, I can't answer. We do know that a range of different spectrum bands are being used for 5G services. We know that there are some fixed wireless access services using millimetre wave. So, for instance, in Italy, that's the case. But relatively few of the operators offering fixed wireless access services state explicitly which spectrum bands those fixed wireless access services use. So I can't give a clear view on that, I'm afraid.
No worries, thanks. And on the looking at millimetre wave specifically, again, I think it's slide 12, we're looking at the 77 millimetre wave devices. I could have asked the same question. Do you know what the sort of breakdown is between those devices? Are they mainly CPEs, smartphones, any sort of detail in that's 77?
Not off the top of my head, no, I'm afraid I don't. I mean, I could certainly come back to whoever asked that question afterwards. I could look the data up, and it's something that you could find out looking quickly in the Gambod database.
And are you aware of any devices capable of operating in 5G standalone on millimetre wave?
Good question. There are a lot of devices that are announced as supporting both 5G standalone and millimetre wave. Whether or not they can do both is debatable, and we don't believe there are many at the moment, and we're trying to ascertain how many there might be. But I don't believe it's commonplace if done much at all.
And I think about saying, obviously, GSA does track both standalone and non-standalone capable devices. Do you see this as a type of dual mode being the majority of the sort of announced devices, both standalone and non-standalone?
Do I see devices as being able to support both of them?
Yes, dual mode.
Certainly, nearly all the 5G devices that we track state that they can support both 5G standalone and 5G non-standalone. Many of them are dual SIM devices. Whether in practical terms they could support both things at the same time would need to be tested, I think.
And looking at private networks, you talk about 240 deployed private networks. Are you tracking? Do we have any information on the different vendors that are involved? Perhaps how many different vendors are actually active in the private networks? Is that something we're tracking?
We don't release information about which vendors are winning which contracts. We tend to focus on the deployments and the types of infrastructure rather than the market share of the players.
Excellent stuff. Thank you much. And I guess one last question, and just looking at private 5G, which is obviously a growing area of focus for GSA as well. Which sectors are you seeing most activity in terms of private 5G networks?
Which sectors? Okay, well that's overwhelmingly manufacturing. Clearly, companies looking to take advantage of the higher speeds and the lower latencies of 5G. They represent by far the biggest group of companies that we've been able to identify so far that are deploying private 5G networks, way ahead of any other category.
Great. So, and then perhaps just finish on this last question, conscious of time. What spectrum bands are being used for private 5G networks?
That's another good question. And an awful lot of deployments don't reveal the spectrum bands they use, but what we do know is that there are networks using 600 megahertz, 2.1 gigahertz, and quite a lot in the C-band spectrum. So the US, sorry, not the US, Germany, for instance, has released C-band spectrum for private and local networks, and that's being used quite extensively. And we can also expect to see quite a lot of C-band spectrum used in the US as a result of the CBRS and other C-band auctions there. But certainly C-band is being well used. And licenses have also been awarded to use millimeter wave for local and private networks. How far they're being used at the moment, not quite sure. But certainly the licenses are being issued, and companies are adopting the licenses.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, and thank you to everyone for your questions. And again, apologies if we didn't get a chance to address your questions specifically. If you are interested in digging into the data more, then I'd certainly encourage you to look at the recent reports on the GSA website. And obviously, if you'd like access to the Gambod database, please do email membership@gsacom.com regarding joining as an associate member to get access to that data. Also published today was the latest fixed wireless access device ecosystem directory that is again available from download from the website. And to keep up to date with the latest information from GSA, I'd encourage you to follow us on our social channels. You'll find GSA on Twitter, LinkedIn, WeChat, and Weibo. And again, you can sign up to the latest email alerts on the website as well. And with that, many thanks. We will share a recording with you immediately after this event. You can also download the presentation. There should be a little clouds download icon at the top of your screen, which will enable you to download the PDF right away. Otherwise, you'll be able to access it on the GSA website shortly after this event. And with that, many thanks.